book on eye movement miscue to Ken. We honor him and remember him as our teacher, mentor, friend, colleague, and co-researcher. Next slide. So our book is but one of Ken Goodman's legacy, as his work has influenced and impacted our own professional thinking, learning, and service. In this slide, you will also see other digital resources that we want you to be aware of as it extends Ken's work. The first is Ken and Yetta Goodman's webpage. It has examples of miscue analysis recordings and retellings. Yetta, you and Ken were also historians for the Literacy Hall of Fame group and were instrumental in developing the next website, the Reading Hall of Fame. This website has now expanded and is a repository of the works of individuals who have influenced thinking on literacy in this century, both in the US and globally. The QR codes would direct you to those websites. The Emma Forum website is another expansion on Ken's legacy because of Ken, Eric, Peter, who's also attending this conference, and early Emma researchers. We have a new field and a new method to explore how reading works. Next slide, please. The book that is in press and entitled Understanding Literacy Using Eye Movement in a Global World brings together authors from the US and around the globe. The slide backdrop is a map of Emma researchers and laboratories. Scanning the QR code will lead you to the interactive map to show you the country, state, universities or schools, and researchers for the closest place you can get to if you're interested in sharing our journey exploring Emma. I can still hear Ken saying to me, Perpy, what are you gonna go do with all that data? So we are writing, collaborating, and sharing information. Literacy knowledge is meant to be shared. Here's one platform to make that happen. Next, please. Next slide, please. You can move to the next slide, Shannon. Oops, maybe tech. I'm just gonna go ahead. So the Emma researchers can be found in 3 continents, North America, Asia, Australia. You see the map there, there's Emma is an innovative method of study that combines research on eye movement and miscue analysis to examine how reading works. There's a lot of room in the map to expand and invite colleagues to research and collaborate with us using Emma methods. Go ahead, next, please. The book also expands on a variety of aspects of literacies, and some are listed on this slide. The QR code, on the other hand, will direct you to other publications on Emma for the past 20 years. This book is practical, research-based, and theoretically driven. It is a groundbreaking contribution explaining literacy from a comprehensive and practical lens. Next, please. Here are the book authors. I'll give you a minute to go and look at them. This shows how Ken's work has influenced our thinking on reading and on our scholarship as well. Next, please. Here are the book highlights. Each part highlights chapters by Emma researchers. Next, please. Let's start first with Ken's chapter, provided the chapter on theory, and includes the following statement. He writes, I argue that to understand eye-brain functions in reading, the researcher must be guided by a theoretical understanding of the process by which readers construct meaning in transactions with written text. From last night's presentation by Brian Camburn and panel conversations by Carol Edelsky, Danny Taylor, and Barbara Flores, the importance of having a good theory is what guided our study of Emma in reading. Next one. Ken writes, this chapter not only challenges misunderstandings and misconceptions of what real literacy events look like, but challenges word-oriented eye tracking methodologies. It calls for a reconsideration of eye tracking methodologies and algorithms that mistakenly conceptualize literacy events and suggests refocusing research and associated methodologies towards the process of selective attention. This chapter provided a theory for us to look at the tool we use to examine reading, Just like with MISCU, he said that we need to look at the machine's algorithms and understand the parameters between what constitutes literacy events and focus on understanding the process of selective attention. Kumi will expand next on the theoretical perspectives framework on how we can view reading from a transactional social psycholinguistic lens next. Go ahead, Kumi.
Sorry, my microphone was muted. Okay, so here is a picture of one of the Emma labs we have. We have about 13 Emma labs around the globe. And at the Salisbury University, we have an Emma study group, which involves faculty members and students and community members. So again, Ken and Yetta's work have influenced our work here at Salisbury University, including this Emma lab. Okay, next slide, please. And the next question is, what is Emma? So there are three major things we'd like to share with you. Is that by tracking eye movements of readers while we record readers' oral reading, we can produce a very powerful base for the study of readers' construction of meaning. Also, the data is both a continuous record of the eye fixations and movements over an entire text and a continuous record of the oral reading of that text and the miscues readers produce. Also, the merged research methodology, eye movement and miscue analysis, EMMA, was brought together to study how perception is related to comprehension in reading. Okay, next slide, please. And then this slide talks about Ken Goodman's model of reading, socio-psycholinguistic transactive reading model. And Ken states the reading is an active search for meaning. And also, reading requires studying the relationships between the reader's thought processes, language, and sociocultural settings in which both the reader and the texter changed during the process. It's a very dynamic, non-linear process. Also, Ken's reading model emphasizes that there is a university reading process by which readers actively integrate, regardless of the languages or dialects we use. Actually, based on Ken's reading model, I was able to learn about my Japanese, my native language, more than ever before. And for example, we integrate our schema background and socio-cognitive reading strategies, while at the same time, we integrate language cueing systems, semantic, syntactic, and graphophonic, as well as pragmatic cues in order for us to make sense of what we're thinking, what we're reading in our society and the community. So reading is a dynamic, non-linear, and a complex socio-psycholinguistic process. Okay, next slide, please. And I love this chart in the book by Yetta, Dorothy, and Caroline. And this represents how we integrate multiple socio-cognitive strategies. And I use this every time when I teach my course. And okay, next slide, please. Okay, now Purpi is going to go back and then discuss more aspects of Emma.
So another chapter in the book is where we actually discuss the EMMA methodology. So Poonam and I wrote this, and we talked about that in the past 20 years that have brought us numerous changes in the eye tracking machines. It also resulted in changes in the design of eye movement miscue studies. So what has remained consistent, though, is that EMMA as a research methodology is the view of reading as a transactional social psycholinguistic process. So like the other EMMA researchers, we also have worked using various machines from the University of Arizona. When we first, I worked at that as a graduate student using the 504, and that's the left side hand corner of the screen. And then now at Towson University, the EMMA lab, where we gather data on the desktop D7 and the mobile eye. The pandemic has brought challenges to our work, but we'll share later on how we were able to address some of these issues that we had. Next, please. So there, in a chapter, we also review a lot of the tools. We discuss some of the eye tracker machines utilized by Emma researchers, each one with its own algorithms and process. So knowing and understanding the tool is part of the procedure for doing Emma. Each researcher is specialized in their own eye trackers. Because of the pandemic, we lost access to our labs and files. But here is a Padlet of a virtual file that I use for teaching and learning about Emma. It is an in-progress work, so it is an active and dynamic page. I use the resources in this Padlet to share eye tracking information, books on eye tracking currently reading, and Emma video examples that I use to teach Emma in our courses. Next one. So in this methods chapter that Poonam and I wrote, we also discuss about the eye tracking methods, miscue analysis, and Emma, sharing a common language to immerse Emma students in Emma research work and study is important. So the pictures here show how I've worked with undergraduate students and graduate students as they conduct their own Emma research study. So really, and also the other one, me discussing and sharing Emma data with Towson University students. Common concepts or terms shared by eye track researchers like Just and Carpenter's eye mind concept would suggest that eye movements provide dynamic information of where a reader is focusing attention is discussed. We also explain cortical activity that's related to a subject's attentional mechanisms, such as fixations and saccades. We know that the brain continuously learns from the environment. So eye movement research shows that there is a lull in this continuous input during the saccadic movement when the eyes are moving from one spot to another, represented by the lines you will see later in Emma data, where it is safe to say that we are blind during those fast movements or saccades. This ties well with Ken Goodman, Peter Fries, and Steven Strauss' explanation in their book, Reading the Grand Illusion, that when the eye stops, it focuses on the text in order for that part of the text to be useful for the reader. We introduce and define concepts basic to the field, like fixations, fixation durations, regressions, saccade, areas of interest, etc., and what they mean in our study of reading. Miscue analysis is another critical component that we explained to understand Emma. Next one. So in the chapter, we provided examples of how to represent scan path or map of how the reader reads the text and a visual representation of what the particular reading event looked like. But here is an example from another chapter in an already published book edited by Kathy Whitmore and Rick Meyer. I saw Rick Meyer also in attendance here. My colleagues and I discussed how we use Emma data measures on where the reader looked at. So those are the fixations, the dots there. The larger the dot, the longer the eyes stop there. Where the eyes moved from one spot to another, called the saccades, and the characteristics of the eye miscues produced tell us about reader strategies. Next one. In another article that my colleague and I wrote, we explored how pre-service teachers' understanding of Emma can help them design digital resources like book trailers for use with children. The image in this slide shows Andrea, a pre-service teacher, reading a multimodal video trailer. Her fixation data where her eyes stopped shows that she did not look at every letter or every word. Her eye track also shows eye movements that focus on the face in the image and move from text to image and back to the text again. You may also want to explore Sharon Murphy's new book, Sense Making. I think I also saw Sharon here in attendance at the conference. And there's a section there on children reading illustrated text aloud for teachers and researchers. Next one. So Shannon and I are also working on some studies on graphic novels. And here's another set of data using the HIT maps in tandem with miscue analysis. The red color represents long duration in that particular area. So a lot of ways to look at Emma data. And the final, next slide. So we discussed in the chapter Emma research for the past 20 years, noting how the method was developed and transformed from the early studies in 2000 when it was first created, Eric Paulson, studies by Peter Duckett and then examine the diversity of participants' text and language. So here, and also discuss the future avenues, what's next for Emma research. So we want to play an example here of a mobile eye data of Maya, who was 8 years old, reading The Boat in the Basement. So I'm hoping that you are familiar with
Okay,
Boat
read
in
the
the
passage
Basement.
out loud. I
Before,
will just do the
oh,
pressing, okay?
uh, Shannon,
Are you
before
ready?
you, Shannon, before you play it, let me just go finish very quickly. So if you're not familiar with that one passage, it has some embedded errors in it, but pay attention to how Maya read this one. Ken said, readers read for meaning, and it is more effective and efficient when we do this. Maya's miscues here in this particular reading and her eye movements shows a visual representation of reading in the moment. So let's watch before and afterwards, Kumi will lead us into the next chapters that we will share from the book. So go ahead,
Okay, read the
Shannon.
passage out loud. I will just do the pressing, okay? Are you ready? Read aloud.
A woman was building her boat in the basement. When she finished the boat, she discovered that it was too big to go through the door. So he had to take the boat apart to get it out. She should have planned ahead.
Okay, so today we have further invitation to Emma. Oh, sorry. Okay, so by using Emma data, we can invite children, their families, teachers, and researchers to examine their assumptions about readers and the reading processes. And today we have two of the book chapters to share with all of you. The first one will be presented by Shannon, focusing on a second grader's reading strategies. And then second chapter will be presenting today is by Honor, focusing on her self-study, working with her mentors to talk about the processes, how she's becoming an emergent Emma researcher. Okay, so here is Shannon.
Thanks, Kimmy. So I'm Shannon Tucker, and Harvey and I wrote a chapter using Emma to examine a second graders' reading strategies. And in this chapter, we take a parent researcher perspective and believe families aid literacy development and long-term reading success. In this chapter, my role has been as a parent researcher, collaborating with Perpy as a literacy researcher. And taking the parent research approach has been done previously. Kabuto and Martins have used this approach to examine literacy in the sociocultural context of children. And here we extend that and using Emma research to help visualize and contextualize my child's reading growth. So in our case study, in our chapter, we have studied Spencer, my son, and this was done in the summer of 2018 when Spencer was 7 years old and he was moving from second grade to third grade. And at the end of second grade, he was at an FNP level Q and was an academically proficient reader who loved reading, regularly reading at home, and at the time was developing a love of graphic novels. So we selected two multimodal text, one a fiction text, Ramona Quimby, age 8 by Beverly Cleary, and then Who Was Amelia Earhart from the Who Was series by Kate Boehm Jerome. And, you know, a few pages at the beginning of each text were selected. And because Spencer had no prior experience with these texts from school assignments, library visits at school at home, and they were selected for reading level, and then that they both included text and complementary supportive images. So in our process, for this study, we used a Tobii X3 120 eye tracker with Tobii Studio Pro that and structured two text readings over a single afternoon. So each reading was set up separately so we could provide Spencer with a break between reading sessions. Here we used a 5-point calibration process at the beginning of the reading or the session to basically calibrate where Spencer's eyes were in relation to the screen so we can accurately measure his eye movement. And here we used a 5-point calibration instead of a 9-point, just to shorten the overall time for the sessions. Prior to each reading, and after the calibration, Spencer was instructed to read aloud as he would at home. And if he came to something he didn't know, just to do his best during a reading. And then after each of the oral readings, we had an oral unaided and aided retelling immediately followed. And that process continued. We read Ramona Quimby, took a break, and then read Amelia Earhart. In our data analysis, we used the MISCU analysis classroom procedure, and then followed this analyzing the complementary image support. So the intersection of taking Emma data and then looking at multimodal design. So here, just to start off, this is a chart that we have in our chapter, and this includes our MISCU analysis and some of our eye movement data for Spencer's readings of Ramona and Amelia. So we see from looking at Spencer's MISCU data, he has a strong knowledge of language and its use from his high syntactic and semantic acceptability scores. He has knowledge of language patterns and his comprehension of sentences, and he's aware of story structure and can predict text meaning. And his miscues didn't change the meaning of sentences in the context of the story most of the time. Yet, despite these high scores, Spencer's holistic comprehension in the Ramona Quimby text was only 40% compared to Amelia Earhart, that was 80%, and even with the aided retelling. Based on Spencer's experience reading, and the Ramona text was at the beginning of the chapter, so there was a lot of description, not a lot of character action. This could have contributed to his lack of understanding, but we felt that the use of unfamiliar vocabulary concepts and miscues and key character names led to confusion on relevant details later in the chapter, and this caused some of his confusion. And then here, just later on in the eye movement data, you can see the mean fixation durations between the text and Ramona Quimby and Amelia was almost twice as much. So, more attention on words, and he spent more time concentrating and trying to, as he tried to decode those unfamiliar words. Here we mentioned and saw some previous example of heat maps. This is a heat map of a miscue sheet in process for the Ramona text. So you can just see the bright red areas where Spencer's attention had a higher number of fixations on those words. And then here for our scan paths, we can see for this segment of a sentence how Spencer related his reading to the images on the page. And I just have a few small segments of Spencer's reading that I'll play for you now.
I get to ride the bus to school all by myself. Ramona Proctor's big sister beatrice at breakfast. Hers, ha ha to all of you if you don't hurry up, said Mrs. Quimby as she swished suds in the dish pan. She stood back from the sink so she would not spatter the white uniform she wore in the doctor's office where she worked as a receptionist.
So there we saw a few of Spencer's miscues, beet rice for Beatrice and receptionist. And these were unfamiliar words for Spencer. And as a parent, that's something that is important because in the context of our daily lives, those words were not used in our household at the time. Transitioning, looking at Amelia Earhart, again, we can see a heat map here on where Spencer's his fixations were concentrated, across the pages, and we can take a look at a brief reading here as well.
In the 1920s, Amelia became a pilot. This was in a time when the airplane was still a new invention. Not many people knew how to fly one. It was even more unusual for a woman to fly planes. But Amelia set many flying records to prove that she was the best.
So we talk in a lot more detail in our chapter on Spencer's readings, but at a high level quickly, Spencer's focuses on written text, and he is using images to make meaning, and focusing on the character faces. His regressions are concentrated on unfamiliar words. So, particularly in the Ramona text, not understanding the name Beatrice and instead saying beet rice. His later ability not being able to correctly describe characters or understand jobs, because he had no familiarity with that. Kirby, I think you wanted
Yeah,
to.
and I want to add too that I think with those videos that we saw, we were able to really see in terms of how Spencer was using both the text and the images, despite the nature of the text that we asked the students to read. His strategy really used both of those print and images as he was reading as well.
And I think that's, the power of, scan paths and the recorded video over time to be able to see how he's making those relations. And, here in terms of the parent researcher context, for the overall reading, Spencer for Ramona, he may sound proficient, but his comprehension was not. Unfamiliar words and concepts, particularly character names, severely affected his comprehension. And the social-cultural context of everyday life, is important because as a parent researcher, for our study, the Emma data, ended at retelling, but after these sessions, Spencer had conversations. What was a receptionist? Asking questions about the primary and intermediate schools, which here in the US, at least in Maryland, we call them elementary and middle schools. So not being able to really understand the context of the story, is important, and knowing our daily lives really helped with understanding, why his comprehension and reading development there is as it was. So, in our implications in this context, Emma can really provide an important tool to help families understand how children transact with text and their strategies, as it relates to their lived experiences. And Purby, I don't know if you want to add anything more.
You said it well.
Yeah,
You will see other examples when Honor also shares about
absolutely.
her experience.
So I'm going to pass it over to Honor.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
So I am the focal participant in this qualitative self-study and worked with a team of researchers, including Judith Franczak, Heather Porter, and Kumi Kim. At the time, I was a first-year doctoral student, a graduate research assistant, and an emerging Emma scholar. As a practitioner in my past, I worked as an English teacher and interdisciplinary leader in a rural Appalachian school on the Qualla boundary for the Eastern Band of Cherokees. Then I went international to the Dominican Republic and then to Jordan. Next slide, please. In the context for our study was at Salisbury University. We were a varied team of researchers, and with a lot of different interests. We worked from adolescent, adult, and early childhood literacy. And we also brought different frameworks, including disciplinary literacy, critical literacy, and of course, the exploration of the socio-psycholinguistic model of reading. The question for our inquiry was, what insights does an Emma researcher, myself, develop through an Emma experience as a collaborative inquiry? Next slide, please. You'll see that our data sources were audio recorded samples of unaided and aided retelling, as well as reading samples, which were my own. We engaged in miscue analysis, the use of reflective memos, video recording of eye movement and oral reading, as well as eye movement data from our data viewer software and collaborative conversations. In the next slide, you will be watching a video in which I make multiple miscues, and I invite you to think about what you see when you do that. Can you go one forward, Shannon? Sorry.
Oh, Honor.
Yeah.
So
and then I'll go back.
Oh, okay, go.
I'll go back. Okay, thank you.
Man who thought that no one worked as hard as he did. One evening when he came home from work, he said to his wife, "What do you do all day while I am away cutting wood?" "I keep house," replied the wife, "and keeping the house hard work." Keeping the house is hard work. "Hard work," said the husband, "you don't know what hard work is. You should try cutting wood." "I'll be glad to," said the wife. "Why don't you do my work someday? I'll stay home and keep house," said the woodman. "If you stay home to do my work, you'll have to make butter, carry water from the well, wash the dishes, clean the house, and look after."
Okay, could you go back, Shannon? Thank you. So you'll see that in that clip, we use this as part of the triangulation of our miscue data. We looked at the video and the audio recordings and really made sure that when we were analyzing Emma data, that we also looked at where the eye was moving on the text using the recorded video. We also went through a multi-cycle coding process following the miscue analysis procedure 3. And then to ensure inter-rater reliability, we really had rich conversations. Each member of our research team listened and reviewed our marked and coded TypeScript, and then we engaged in conversation to see how we were all making meaning of the TypeScript and the coding. So could you go forward to Shannon? Sorry. Yeah, so this is the first area of interest from our study. You'll see that I made 2 high quality miscues. I substituted came for a typo cam, and I also substituted home for the phrase near the house. Then I regressed and self-corrected for that second substitution. In terms of an emerging Emma researcher and engaging in this process, what this area of interest really showed me was how dynamic my own reading process was, because I was predicting, I was confirming, I was disconfirming, and I was self-correcting. And it also showed me how non-linear my own eye movement patterns were. Next slide, please. In this slide, you'll see that I substituted dishes for clothes. at first, when I was analyzing this, I was really focused on a word level analysis. It was very word centric. I was focusing on accuracy. But after conversations with the after conversations and dialogue with our team, I realized that a lack of graphophonic similarity actually makes this a high quality miscue, and that I was integrating my sociocultural background and knowledge as well as my schema when I read this text, because in my own experience growing up, we would say wash the dishes instead of wash the clothes, and we would say do the laundry instead of wash the clothes. So I was just bringing that to my own reading experience. Next slide, please. So what we learned as a group, through reflection, I was really able to deconstruct and demystify my own internalized approaches to analysis. And that was really moving away from a word-centric idea of reading that focused on accuracy. It also raised questions for me about my existing paradigm of reading, and I recognized that I needed to attend to the reader's comprehending process during observable acts of reading. The collaborative dialogic engagement was so crucial to me as I reflexively thought about Ken Goodman's socio-psycholinguistic transactional model of reading. It's such a complex experience to engage with, and I really needed the support and the ongoing conversation with a research team as I encountered my own uncertainty and certainty through the experience as a participant, but also the experience as a research. And it was an iterative process that really provided recurring opportunities to question, to reflect, to synthesize, and to examine Emma data. And then also, in addition, I've gone further now into a graduate level course with Kumi on miscue analysis. And so all of this is just providing rich opportunities for me to engage with Emma. I think that's the last slide. Yes. Thank you.
Our afternoon session. And our next speaker is Steve Strauss, who who is talking about on the theme. I'm sorry, I lost track of I had a snack and lost track of my program. Beyond the Grand Illusion, Reading in the Science of Science Denial. And he's a co-author with Ken Goodman, Peter Fries, and I think Eric Paulson of a book on the Grand Illusion. So we're looking forward to hearing Steve. Steve is both a neurologist and a linguist. And Steve has the singular ability of being the one person who can give a second opinion on both an RMI or an MRI. So take it away.
Debbie, that was better than any joke I had planned. All right, we got. Let me see if I can pull up my PowerPoint. I'm going to try to keep this informal. Some of you know that I can have trouble sticking to what my plans are, but help yourself to refreshments. Okay, first let me thank Alan and Debbie for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here, and thank you to Yetta and people I haven't seen in a long time, like Jack, D'Amico, how are you? I want to talk about what the next chapter would be if the book continued, if the book added more chapters. There are 8 chapters in The Grand Illusion, and I I'm going to try to lead up to what chapter 9 would be, what the title of it would be, and why we need to have another chapter. In fact, probably more than one chapter. It's mainly because the challenge is still out there, and I don't mean the challenge of having to compete with other theories, which of course is always a challenge, but the challenge of finding ourselves in a climate of science denial and pseudoscience, which is not new to history. I mean, it goes back centuries, but we are all living through a number of them, including climate denial and a number of others that I'll mention at some point. Denial of evolution, and but countering with things that sound scientific, like creation science and intelligent design. I think that Ken's model of reading finds itself in exactly the same situation. So we're up against more than just another theory of reading to deal with and show why our theory explains the facts better, but with a larger context. And Ken certainly would have wanted us to, appeal to context in order to fully understand what's going on. But the larger context is what's is another part of the challenge that we face. So whenever I think about the next chapter, I think about one of my favorite books. And for those of you who know me, I am not going to sing the Cowardly Lion song right now. You've heard that before, and I'll save that for another special event. But in reading The Wizard of Oz, you have to, if you think it through really seriously, as we all should, because it's such a great work of literature, there has to be another chapter because the problem is not solved. Dorothy's problem wasn't solved. All she had was a dream. So once the dream is over, the only thing that really took place in the story was there was a storm, and now the storm's over. So now what? Well, what's the next chapter? The next chapter is that there's going to be a knock at the door, and the knock on the door is going to be from Miss Gulch. She's back to retrieve Toto, because that's what the whole problem was. And L. Frank Baum didn't include that chapter, but he certainly laid the foundation for us to think about whether or not Dorothy learned something from her dream that would put her in a position to meet that challenge. And I want to pose the same question, the same issue for us. Have we learned enough from Ken's work, and not just his work, but his actions in the field of not only reading, but dealing with our society to help us meet our next challenge? Well, Dorothy showed in some ways, I think, that she didn't learn her lesson completely. She came back and told Auntie Em and Uncle Henry how much she loved them, and there was no place like home, even though they did absolutely nothing to stop Miss Gulch from taking Toto away. They, shed a couple of tears, but that was about it. So did Dorothy learn that she could not rely on them, that she had to rely on her own knowledge, her own convictions, her own strength? And she did, because everything that happened during her dream that posed a challenge to her, she rose to the occasion. She challenged the wizard. She defended her friends. She threw water on the Wicked Witch. She did what she had to do. And the Dorothy the meek became Dorothy the fighter. And I think that to understand the position that we're in right now with Ken's theory and his model of reading, we have to also think of ourselves as fighters and know what we're fighting against. So I'll return to the question. Once I figure out how to get to my next slide. Oh, I know how to do it. There we go. Okay. Which is, what's the next chapter in The Grand Illusion?
Steve, we're not seeing the slides.
Oh, you're not seeing the slides?
Right.
Oh, maybe you have to do it then. Why aren't you seeing the slides?
At the bottom of the screen, it says share screen.
Hold on. Did you give it to me?
I made you co-host.
I don't see share screen.
Did you?
Oh, I see it. I see it. I see it. Sorry. You're right. Hey, when you're right, you're right.
And then click on your PowerPoint that's open rather than your,
Do you see it? No.
we do not, we now see it, or it's coming up.
My screen sharing is paused. Stop share.
Debbie, you have to, whoever has the screen has to give it to Steve.
No, it says he started screen sharing.
Yeah, but why isn't it happening?
Did you click on your PowerPoint
Yeah. Hmm.
and your PowerPoint is open?
Yeah. Let me do it again.
All right, try starting your PowerPoint show.
I'm sorry, folks. We'll get this. Do you
There you
see
go.
it now?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, good.
Good.
Okay, well, that's what I just was talking about.
Okay.
Steve, you may
All
want
right.
to press play,
All right.
go to slideshow and then press play the show so we see the full screen.
Boy, boy.
There you go. And then mouse over. There you
From
go.
beginning or from, yeah.
Good. We're good.
Is that better?
Yep.
Oh,
Perfect.
good. Okay. So here's why we're in a situation of science denial. Ken's model is a scientific model of the reading process, and the people who are opposing it, the people who call themselves the scientists of reading, do not have a model which explains anywhere near the amount of facts in the matter, the amount of evidence, well, I should say data that Ken's model shows. And their model, in fact, has a lot of features which show that at some level, it is not really a scientific model of reading. So I want to talk about those two areas. What's scientific about Ken's model? What's not scientific about the other model? And then what is it that's keeping that other model in power? Because they are in power, and that's the difference that we're talking about. Okay. Well, Ken provided us, in order to understand this a little more, with an appreciation of context. Context in constructing meaning, context in understanding why a scientific theory as powerful as his is can still be rejected if we look at the context for as a resource to understand that. And we have to keep in mind that the government is playing a role in preventing his model from getting out there in the public domain as much as we think it deserves to be out there. They have different concerns, and I'll get into that in a little bit too. What we see being promoted is really just scientific fairy tales that parade as a science of reading, and I will go into some of their claims as well. We've seen this before, as I mentioned. Evolution is denied, climate damage is denied. You see claims from academics at Harvard that women aren't as smart as men are in mathematics. We've always dealt with this, and we're dealing with it again. We've seen theories about the racial inferiority of people of color. This is a very serious matter, and it affects us as well. So whenever we see these kinds of claims that what we believe is non-science, pseudoscience, and nonsense, passing for science as a challenge to what we're doing, the question that will always help us understand it is who's benefiting from those ideas, who is gaining from it. And it always points to economic interests. Wall Street is who gains from people believing that some members of society are so inferior to others that they simply don't deserve to get paid as much. Let me talk about some of the scientific aspects of Ken's model. We know that eye movement studies, as we just heard in the previous session, show that readers do not read one word at a time from left to right and top to bottom. If it did show that, let's say eye movement studies really did show that readers fixate one word at a time, going left to right and then top to bottom, that would immediately be evidence against this theory. That would be evidence that we really do read in a linear fashion. And Ken said, no, we don't. We, for a variety of reasons, the search for meaning is not always linear. We go back and forth between our own representations of knowledge and beliefs to the information that we derive from the text, and we construct meaning in doing that. We don't think from left to right. We don't think from top to bottom. Those are irrelevant parameters to describe what thinking is. Dimensions like left and right, top and bottom. But this is the kind of theory that's imposed on researchers who adopt the so-called science of reading model. The fact that there is a type of evidence that could refute Ken's theory and doesn't is what shows that it is an empirically based scientific model. If you can imagine what the evidence is that would refute it and the evidence doesn't exist, you've got yourself a good hypothesis. Ken's model generalizes to other areas of known scientific truth. For example, there are many, many studies in psychology which demonstrate that in order to conceptualize, for example, a visual field, a set of sounds, we project predictions and we confirm and disconfirm them in the same way that we do that when we are constructing meaning from a transaction with a text. We don't know in advance what we're going to find when we do that. And that's why what reading is in Ken's model is a type of exploration. It's not a model where we are going after something which is known in advance. That would require that we are all that we be omniscient. Ken's model is a filling in model. We don't look at what sometimes studies show a third of the words on a page. Oops. And yet when a reader reads aloud, it sounds as if every single word is being read, even though not every single word has been visualized, appears in the visual field. How do we do that? How does that happen? Well, we know that a reader fills in the blanks, fills it in on the basis of linguistic expressions that make sense. Filling in is a well-known phenomenon in neuropsychology. It's as basic as filling in a blind spot, which appears in everybody's visual field. It has to, because the nerves that collect the visual input at the back of the eye enter the brain in an area where light from the outside cannot shine on that spot, because that's where the nerves are. So even though we don't see the blind spot, it looks to us as if we're seeing a full picture. Part of what we're seeing is actually a blind spot that our brain has filled in order to make the visual scene seem coherent and to make sense. The brain is always making sense. That's the function of the brain, just like breathing is the function of the lungs. And when you can't breathe because there's something stuck in your throat, you realize it then. You start to cough, you get a little anxious, and we don't realize it when we're breathing normally. When we don't make sense, that's when we realize it. When we are making sense, everything seems purely natural, and we're not even aware that that's what we're doing. Now, this happens at all levels of life. Even bacteria do something like that. Bacteria search for sugar in the liquid solution that they live in. They actually have a mechanism inside their cells that allows them to figure out what the concentration of sugar is in the region of water where they're now swimming. And if they sense that it's a pretty good concentration of sugar, the flagella, the little tails, make the bacteria move in a straight line. It's called a run. But if they somehow and in a sense, they're acting as if they believe that they're entering an even higher concentration of sugar, which is what they want. That's what they like to eat. They have a big sweet tooth. But let's say they get to an area of water where there's a lower concentration. Their prediction was wrong. They have to go back and correct. And what they do is they stop running. The flagella spins in a different direction. They tumble around. They orient themselves differently. And now they start their straight run again to find sugar. This is exactly the same phenomenon, but at a molecular level. It's not the psychology of prediction, it's the chemistry of prediction. They go in a certain direction because their body says, I'm seeing more sugar because the sugar is somehow entering. They make a mistake because the water somehow didn't have it, and they make corrections. This happens with insects flying from one branch to another. And how do they know that they're going the right way? It's exactly the same phenomenon. In a sense, you know, if you look at the runs and tumbles of bacteria, you can do a miscue analysis of it, and it's strikingly similar to what we see in reading. Let's see. Ken's model also generalizes with a new revolution that's taking place in neuroscience. Can you hear me? Okay, sorry, I was just checking with my co-pilot here. For a long time, and even when I was in medical school, we learned that this is how the brain interacts with the environment. The senses, the vision, visual sense, sight, sound, touch, enter the specialized organ, your eyes, your ears, your skin, and sends that information to an organ deep in the brain called the thalamus, which you see on this slide. The thalamus is like the grand central station. It's the relay. This is what I was taught. The relay station for all of those sensory inputs. And then what the thalamus does, which is, by the way, my favorite organ, it sends those sensory inputs to the cortex, the outer side of the brain, the more advanced side of the brain, the one that's, from an evolutionary point of view, the most recent part of the brain. And the cortex then puts all those senses together, what you're seeing, what you're hearing, what you're touching, and it creates meaning that way. So meaning in a traditional neuroscientific teaching is the outside coming in, the thalamus collects all that stuff, sends it up to the brain, and the brain figures it out. But in the last 20 years, there's a revolution that's been taking place in neuroscience where we know that the situation is actually the opposite. We know that the cortex, which is the part of the brain that figures things out, that plans, that makes predictions, that confirms predictions, that not just sees but perceives, that doesn't just hear but interprets, that part of the brain actually sends more nerve impulses to the thalamus than what the thalamus is sending up to the cortex. The cortex controls the thalamus and tells the thalamus what to look for based on what its prediction is. Oh, what's happening? Sorry. Ken's model obviously fits into that because, as you can see from some writings on by neuroscientists, the thalamus used to be regarded as a relay station where sensory information from the periphery goes in and is passed on up to the cortex being the area of perception and cognition. But now we know that the thalamus receives far more inputs from the cortex than it does even from the outside world, and that what the brain is doing can be envisaged instead as a process of reiterative, I'm reading this obviously, comparison of top-down predictions with bottom-up information. What was Ken's genius? It was that the field of psychology, which he was involved in, said, this is how psychology works, outside in. The neuroscientists were saying the same thing. They saw everything going into the brain through the thalamus and then landing on the cortex, and the cortex could now do its thing. But neuroscientists are saying, no, the cortex does it first. It makes predictions, and it tells the thalamus what to look for and what not to look for. Finally, regarding the, well, let me turn now to a few things about that are problematic with the science of reading, uh, theory. I put theory in quotes. First, let's take, just focus on the issue of phonics altogether, and whether there is, and what kind of validity there is to the claims that they make about it. First of all, they don't really make a lot of claims because the truth is they've never even studied what phonics is. They've never studied what the relationships really are between letters and sounds. And yet all it would take is a little bit of linguistic analysis. You can think of the letters as a set of objects. There are 26 of them. The sounds, there are 40 sounds. And you can mathematically define a relationship between one set and another set. This is what's often done in linguistics. It would be easy enough for them to do, but they don't even do that. If you do that, you can, I believe, make a good case that each letter has what I like to call a default pronunciation. A default pronunciation means even if that letter can be pronounced with more than one sound, it's one sound in one word, a different sound in another word. For example, the letter B is B in boy, but it's silent at the end of a word like lamb. G is pronounced G in some words, as I'm saying things you already know, but it's, an F in the word enough, with the H that follows it, and similarly. So I would say that B, the sound B, is the default sound for the letter B. For P, the default sound is P, even though it could be silent, like in the word psychiatrist, F, like in the word phone, and that vowels also have default pronunciations. I won't go into all the arguments right now. They come from invented spellings, they come from actual pronunciations, but I believe you can make a case that the default pronunciations for the vowel letters are exactly their letter names, A, E, I, O, U, or U. To say that it's a default sound means that you don't need a rule to tell you that that's what that letter stands for. You see the letter A, it's pronounced A. You see the letter E, it's pronounced E, and so on, unless there is a phonics rule that tells you, no, in this case, it's not going to get its default pronunciation. So with that, let's look at a few examples. If I'm speaking too fast, please send an explosive device to my computer. Mate, meet, might, mote, mute. They're all real words. I looked them up. I wasn't sure about mate. But now, the traditional phonics teaching says, how many times have you heard this? The letter E makes the preceding vowel say its name, makes it long. As if to say, we don't know yet that it's long, it's the letter E that's doing it. But if there is such a thing as a default value, a default sound for a letter, then those letters already are pronounced A, E, I, O, U. And then we can ask, well, what's the silent E doing there? If it's not making the letter A in mate be pronounced mate, why is it there? Well, if the letter E was not there, what would we have? We would have mat. And we would be turning the A into an A, because there is a rule of English orthography which says that if a vowel is followed by a letter, by a consonant letter, which ends the word, then it becomes short. So the letter E in these words, number one, is not making the previous vowel long, it's preventing the previous vowel from becoming short. It's exactly the opposite of what these jokers in the science of reading are saying. Look at the words in number two. Those are pronounced with short vowels. So are the words in 3 and 4 and in 6. In 3, if you took off the letter E, you would have the letter C be pronounced K, because that when the letter C ends a word, it's pronounced with a K sound. You'd have dank, henk, prink, nonk, and dunk. The function of the letter E has nothing to do with the previous vowel. It has to do with an effect that it has on the letter C. What about number 3? And I'll just move on after I discuss this one, although all of these examples are interesting. The sound J can end a word in English, as you can see from these examples: badge, hedge, ridge, they all end in J. There are 3 ways that you can spell J in English: with DG, with the letter J, and with the letter G. But if you study English orthography, you will discover that only one of those is allowed to actually none of them are allowed to end the word. So, for example, DG does not end a spelled word in English, and if you want to spell a word that ends in the sound J, you can do it this way. You can add an E to DG, and that E is silent, and the only function that it plays, the only role it plays in these words is to prevent DG from ending the word. It's a spelling rule. It has nothing to do with the previous vowel. In fact, you can't even make a case that the letter E ever turns the previous vowel into a long one. It's already long. That's one major flaw with the phonics people, that they don't know what phonics is. That's a pretty big flaw. They simplify it, which leads them to other problems, which I won't go into. It's mainly that they claim that every word sounded out has to be accurate in order to identify the word, but you can't get accuracy if you simplify in these cases. Another thing that the science of reading people claim is that the brain is not set up to process visual language, written language, visual language. Why not? Because the brain did not evolve in a setting where there was visual language. It was only oral language. And visual language came many, many tens of thousands of years later. It was a cultural invention, they claim, not a biological, not an innate biological property of the brain. Therefore, written language needs to be taught because the brain is not naturally equipped to acquire it without instruction. It's something cultural. You have to learn culture. You learn all the cultural aspects of your life. You're not born with them, and reading is no different. So Sally Shaywitz, one of their gurus, says that speaking is natural, reading is not, and so on. Well, here's a dilemma that they face, which I'm sure all of you know about. Let's take the 3 words on top, which are on flashcards: meet, meet, and meet. You obviously cannot know what these words are if you're a science of reading person, because the brain can't process visual language, and these are written words. So you need to turn them into sounds. They all turn into the pronunciation meet. They're all homonyms. But now once you've turned them into the pronunciation meet, you don't know which one it is. So whether you're looking at the visual word or hearing the pronunciation, you still haven't identified the word. Well, then they might say, well, okay, now we need context to know which of the meats it is. And then you would say to them, well, if you're acknowledging that you need context, and if you are claiming that you're a scientist, what you need to study is whether or not readers use context to the exclusion of or to a greater degree than they use phonics. Of course, they don't do this. Functional MRI. We've all heard about this. They claim that functional MRIs show where in the brain words are sounded out. And here it is. I got this, I kind of adapted this from one of Shaywitz's writings. It takes place on the left side of the brain, mostly in the rear portion. You're looking at the left hemisphere. The right side is the rear portion, the posterior portion. Here's what a dyslexic reader does, according to their theory. They do not use the rear portion of the brain. They expand on using the front portion. Then they say if you give intensive phonics instruction to these people. Here's what the MRI is going to look like. When you take this person, give them intensive phonics instruction, repeat the MRI, you get this. You get what a normal reader does in their definition of a normal reader, which is somebody who can sound out letters. And what's the claim that they make from this? They claimed that they have used phonics to repair a diseased brain. But that's obviously not, there isn't sufficient evidence to draw that conclusion. The only conclusion you can draw is that the people who they taught phonics to learned what they were taught. They learned it. So that's why the MRI changed. That's the only thing that you can conclude from that. There are many other examples I could add one last thing, that, you know, the science of reading people also claim that dyslexia is a genetic disorder. There is a gene that gives people reading problems. They put themselves in a big contradiction when they say that, because if reading is not natural, if reading is not biological, how could there be a gene that makes you unable to read? If reading is cultural, how could there be a gene that prevents you from learning something which is not biological but strictly cultural? It'd be like having a gene that prevents you from becoming Jewish. It's something purely cultural. It makes no sense. Okay, what are we up against? We are up against a society which finds itself right now in great competition, economic competition with other countries in the world, mainly China. And if you read the newspaper every day, you'll see another article bashing China. Not because they don't really care about the human rights record. They care about the fact that China is now #1 in the world in trading in goods. That's not very pleasant for the people in Wall Street to hear. Their solution is to create a new workforce. They created STEM. They want scientists, technicians, engineers, mathematicians. They don't want reading as exploration. They want reading as information processing, a completely different phenomenon. And they have gone, you know, they're really quite desperate. They're so desperate that now, even under the Biden administration, they're talking about spending $100 billion to develop new nuclear weapons delivery systems. And there's only one country in the world that they're softening up for all of us to believe should be our enemy, and that's China, in my opinion. So you might want to take a look at a report that was written by Joel Klein, who all of you New Yorkers know, and Condoleezza Rice, who all of us know, which came out almost 10 years ago, which said that the corporate education reform is being done as a matter of U.S. national security. That in order to keep America safe, we have to fix the nation's public schools, K through 12. That's what I put here. Then Sally Shaywitz has added to that people who do not follow the science of reading are committing educational malpractice. That's the expression she has used, and as I'm sure a number of you know. In medicine, I can get sued if I commit malpractice. I could go to jail if I commit fraud, like Medicare fraud. They have laid the foundation for making that case as well. So all of this brings me to what's the next chapter to the Grand Illusion. What's chapter 9? Well, Ken's model, if we want to think about the larger context, requires us to focus on the central political feature of whole language, which in my opinion is democratic classrooms. Classrooms where students and educators collaborate together to come up with a meaningful curriculum, meaningful literature, and so on. That's not what the reformers want, what the science of reading people want. They want to control the curriculum. There is a contradiction in interests between whole language and what is going on out there in the real world. Democratic classrooms versus undemocratic classrooms. Undemocratic classrooms being constructed by a society which is fundamentally undemocratic, because even as the ancient Greeks said, if most of the people in the society are poor, that's the number one clue that it's not democratic. Because if it was democratic, they would vote to not be poor anymore. So something is compelling them to remain poor. So chapter 9 is, you can't build democratic classrooms in an undemocratic society. We need to do something about this. It's going to take more than just having the right reading theory. It's going to take more than just voting for the right people. It's going to take thinking about what a truly democratic society is all about. And the authors of chapter 9, you'll hear at 3:30 today, Bess Altwork and Rick Meyer. And I hope I left time for questions and comments. How do I get myself back on this? Oh, here we go. Oh, good. I don't hear anybody. No.
Debbie, we can't hear you.
Oh, yeah, she was muted.
I'm muted. I'm muted. Yes, we do have time, and we have a comment by Carrie Ann Warham, I believe, and she's saying that sign languages are processed in the same areas in the brain as spoken languages. She's a deaf translator, is a doctoral student in our program. And Carrie Ann, I don't know if you wanted to say more. She has a citation.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, I just thought it was interesting because you were talking about how part of their argument is that it's visual language, printed language isn't being processed in the same way, but all the sign languages, we have evidence that we can process language visually.
Yes, they seem to have ignored that very obvious point. They never talk
Many
about
people
it.
do. Many people do.
And Stephanie Fuhr wanted to know, how is lack of play influencing the brain?
Lack of, I'm not sure I understand the question. Lack of child.
I think she's talking about, go ahead, Stephanie.
So I noticed that, we're developmentally, we're pushing kids to be forced readers as early as 5, if not even 3, and they're looking already to test for dyslexia at the age of 2 in some places. So my curiosity is that we're losing play-based learning. And also kids are more going on the computer now at a younger age. And I'm just wondering if there's any research out there around the brain and the influence of lack of play as well as technology.
Well, it's a very good question. I'm not really aware of any research on that, but obviously the more isolated a child becomes in reading, the more we move away from Vygotskian principles and how learning takes place, because it's social, involving peers, and in terms of the neuroscience research on that, I'm not familiar with it, but I have conjectured, based on the point that you just made, that the age at which they're trying to get kids to learn to read is becoming younger and younger. In fact, as you probably know, I'm sure you know this better than I do, they've canceled nap time in kindergartens all across the country, so they have more time to teach them phonics and prepare them for tests. 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds. One day they're going to try to prove that they can teach kids how to read in the womb, because if they don't get kids reading by the age of 2, China's really going to take over.
Steve, can you hear me? It's Yetta.
Hi, Yetta.
I was going to save this question for later, but since I get so excited when you hear bringing all your knowledge to this, I'm going to say what I wanted to say, because I think that we all confuse ourselves. And I think even as holistic people, I still can hear teachers when they're working with a kid and the kid makes, the teacher thinks she's thinking about miscues, but the kid is making really, from the teacher's point, a mistake, because the kid is trying to work at the word that's in front of them. And although whole language people tend to be moving away from the concept of looking at letters and sounds, we still use the word word as if it has an entity in and of itself out of the context of language itself. And I keep still hearing teachers saying to a kid, as the kid's moving through a sentence, you know, look at the word, look at the word. And the kid looks back at the word and says, I don't know that word. I'm not really a reader. And whenever I still hear that, I realize that we're over-focusing, I think many of us, the focus of a word in the context, thinking that that is a, that's where it's okay for the kid to do that. Rather than, and this is what Ken used to say all the time, keep the kid's brain thinking about that they're making sense, not looking at words. And that's the linguistic issue that I'm raising in relationship to thinking that words exist, sound-wise, as you've been saying, or meaning-wise, out of the context of its whole. And I'm not quite sure what that whole is, if even a sentence is enough.
Well, I think we've argued about this about 20, I think last count was 28,352 times. But that's okay, Yetta, because I look forward to the next 28,000. As a scientific, as a scientifically based concept in linguistic theory, I still do believe that there is such a thing as a word, that there are words. Does that mean that's what we need to focus on when we teach reading or when we understand reading? No, but you know, there are you know, levels of subatomic particles in quantum mechanics that are real, but we don't think about them when we play baseball. When we hit a ball with a bat, we don't have to. It's not part of that, you know, the level of reality that we're dealing with, even though it is part of reality. So, you know, I don't think there's a contradiction between the two. You can believe in words as a scientific entity, but you don't need to, at the same time, believe that that plays a role in what our purposes are with language.
I guess the point that I'm trying to make is, and I'm not arguing with you at all. In fact, I agree with everything you've just said, believe it or not.
Oh.
What I'm arguing a little bit about is to let teachers become aware is that when you're talking to a kid and you're reading with that kid and the kid is looking at the word, to say to them, look closer at the word, doesn't help them as much as giving them permission to think of what the sense is they're making as they use that word in the context of whether it's a sentence or even the previous sentence or a paragraph before. Because I've seen when I've looked at miscues that I can find that the kid picked up an idea from 2 paragraphs before and that influenced their miscue.
Well, of course, I agree with you.
I'm going to interrupt and I'll let Steve respond and then we'll move to our break because I don't want to get too off. I think we could talk about this forever. And I see our next speakers nodding their heads because you just set them up. So Steve, you want to make one final comment?
Well, I finally agree with Yetta really on everything she just said, and that makes me very happy. Although I also have enjoyed all my disagreements, but that's okay too, and with Ken. And I get, you know, I just wanted to point out that, I mean, I think the main message that we all need to think about is that as important as the work is that we're doing in language and literacy, there is a larger context that we need to take into consideration. And we all learn to think about context from Ken's work on reading. I think, and Yetta is actually, her comment just now is pointing to that. We need to think about the larger social context, which is turning Ken's model of reading into one of those rejected sciences, like climate science, like evolution, like linguistic science, which shows that everybody in the world has is equal when it comes to language. It's we need to understand why is it that we live in a society which rejects science, even though it needs science. So if people could leave with that message, I think that would be a very useful thing for today's session.
Thank you. That was wonderful. And I'm going to, we're going to take a 2-minute break so you can stand up and stretch. And our speakers will start right about 2:26 here in New York.
Okay, well, welcome. My name is Carol Gillis. I'm from the University of Missouri, Emerita.
I am Anna Osborne. I'm a reading specialist at Jefferson Middle School in Columbia, Missouri, and I'm Carol's student at the university. I recently became a PhD candidate.
And today we are visiting you from Anna's COVID classroom. This is going to be a conversation between Anna and I, and so that's why we're sitting next to one another. We both have been fully vaccinated, and we have the window open, so we're feeling really safe. We're going to talk to you today about collaborative retrospective miscue analysis as a liberatory pedagogy, and we're really going to divide our talk into 3 parts. The first part, just a quick justification of what we mean by CRMA as liberatory. The second part, an overview of a study that we did, a 2-year study. And then the third part, we're going to take the most time in, and that is how did these teachers and students learn about CRMA and learn how to use CRMA. And we found when we shared with teachers, this was something they were most interested in. So we're going to do a little bit more time on that. We're really fortunate to have an extra session at the end of this. We're in room 4. So if you have questions or if you'd like to continue the conversation when we finish, we would love to see you back in that breakout room. Of course, our work grows directly from the work of Ken and Yetta and the work of their students too, Dorothy Watson, Carolyn Burke. And it's also grounded in a firm belief that comes from them about the brilliance of kids and of teachers. And so we hope that our work continues to further their legacy. A number of years ago, when I went to a conference, Bess Altwerger said that miscue analysis was a form of liberatory pedagogy. And by that, because we examine a reader's strength, build on them to help readers be more successful, and then readers can fully participate in democracy. And I remembered that. In fact, I've put that on my miscue analysis syllabus ever since she said it, because it seemed to me such a powerful statement. Okay. But I also think that collaborative retrospective miscue analysis continues that liberatory pedagogy. As Goodman and Merrick said, it's a conferring process with students, teachers, whereby the students know themselves as readers, observe and evaluate their transaction with others, revalue their strengths as learners and as language users. And so to kind of refresh my thinking about what liberatory means, I took a look at Shore and Freire's book, and although they have wonderful concepts in that book, there were 3 that I thought were closely tied to CRMA. And one is that whole notion of unveiling. Freire talks about unveiling the reality which is being hidden by the dominant curriculum. And in reading, the dominant curriculum in many schools is that scripted skills program. So when teachers and students work together to carefully examine what readers do, they unveil that old curriculum and illuminate what reading really is. He also talks about dialogue. And I'm someone who's studied talk for 30 years, so I am a firm believer in dialogue. And in CRMA, students are in dialogue with one another. They start with those protocol questions, but very quickly it emerges into real discussions about language. And the most important question they talk about was, what was your brain doing? What were you thinking about when you made that miscue? And it's in that dialogue that they really began to go deep into how does language work? How does reading work? Then the third thing that Freire talks about is empowerment. And Goodman calls that revaluing. When kids revalue through CRMA, they receive that empowerment. And we found that our students develop more confidence and more agency as readers. Because I was working with two teachers and Anna hadn't really done very much with miscue analysis before, she was really brave to join me in this study. And because Danielle had done quite a bit, we really drew from these foundational texts, from Reading Miscue Inventory, from the Essential RMA, from our book in Reading Conversations, to help them sort of have a notion of this foundation. You might add something there if you want.
I think that Carol is being very generous to what I knew. I knew nothing at this point about RMA. I was trained in administering the DRA, and I was trained in running records with my students. But I had not taken miscue analysis yet. I had not enrolled in my doc program yet. And so I had very little. I was the novice in this study. Danielle was in the midst of her PhD program at the time. She had already taken miscue analysis. I looked to Carol and I looked to Danielle very much as my mentors throughout this process. And some days I was learning what we were going to do the day before we did it in the classroom. And so let me tell you a little bit more about our classrooms. So our reading intervention program in the middle schools, so I teach 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, it is mandated by our district. We identify students as reading one or more years below level, using the DRA2, using teacher recommendations, and also if they score below the 25th percentile rank on the STAR test. Reading intervention as a teaching context can be a very tough teaching context. We work with a large number of free and reduced lunch students. Danielle had about 58% free and reduced lunch students at the time. I had about 39% students on free and reduced lunch at the time. My school at the time was a welcome center for English language learners. And so I had more English language learners. I think I had the majority of the Latinx students, students from Tanzania, Cambodia, Korea, Thailand. In the first year that we did this, that was the makeup of our students. The second year that we did this, we had a little bit different makeup. Everything depended on which students were entering my school at the time. Let's see, we were very concerned, both Danielle and I were at crossroads in our careers as reading teachers. We were very concerned that we were working with students who were word callers. We were mandated by our district to do running records and also to do the AIMSweb assessment. And there were a lot of other issues. We talked extensively about the fact that students came into our classroom from day one and said things like, why am I in this reading class? Or I'm really stupid and that's why we're in here. We were worried about the relationships with students. And we really were worried about engagement. and engaging our students in a love of reading.
Methodologically, our theoretical stance was, first of all, the Ken's model of reading, socio-psycholinguistic transactive model. And then we also kind of took a sociocultural look because as we were investigating these students and their changes, there was a lot of positioning, students positioning themselves, positioning one another, and that helped us to kind of tease that out. Our question over these 2 years was what happens when two teachers initiate, use, modify, and critique CRMA with selected reading intervention classes. And all of those words were important, that they were initiating this, they were using it, but they were also modifying it for their particular setting and for their particular kids. And they were critiquing it. They were critiquing each other's work. They were critiquing the articles that were coming, that they were reading. And all of those things were happening there. We used practitioner research, and we depended on this book, Inquiry as Stance, by Lytle and Cochran Smith, because that seemed the most natural and important way to do this research. This was a collaboration between the two teachers and me. We were all researchers. We really tried hard to level that power that went throughout. We had a lot of meetings together. We shared information. Everyone here was a researcher. I wasn't the researcher and they were the teachers. We were all researchers. We used the context as the inquiry site. We had a systematicity and tried to follow inquiry as stance as our methodology. In terms of gathering data, the students did the Burke reading interview at the beginning and at the end. We looked at their markings on their CRMA sheets. We looked at the auto recordings, their artifacts, their interviews. And for the teachers, although we only did 2 formal interviews, there were informal conversations every day. When I was in the classroom, I would talk with them at the end of that time together. Lots of times I'd get a call from, from one or the other. We'd have another conversation. I think Anna kept journals and Danielle kept a blog. We also did the DeFord theoretical orientation, the beginning and at the end. And as you can see the analysis there, we did miscue analysis for the CRMA, and then repeated rereadings of the data, recording the patterns. Each teacher did their own students, but then we traded for reliability. We triangulated the patterns across the data sources. And this started to be a 1-year study, but it ended up being a 2-year study because it was just too rich. We were just finding out too many things, and we needed to continue this to really find out what a new group of kids would do with CRMA.
And one thing I want to highlight about our use of the Burke Reading Inventory is that I had been trained when I started as a reading specialist to administer the Burke at the beginning of the year by my literacy coach, and to quickly look at it, to get an idea, to know my students a little better. But that when we looked at the Burke Reading Inventory, we took a much closer look than I had ever taken as a teacher. And so one of the things that stood out to us was that almost immediately I had students who were mentioning words, words, words. Like I look at the word and I have to try to figure out the word. And if the word doesn't make sense, I'm going to ask someone to help me with the word. And then we had another group of students who said things like, oh, I'm having a movie in my head, or, I just love to think about the characters in the story. Or sometimes when I read, I love to talk back to the characters in the story. And so those were 2 distinct groups that stood out to us when we looked closer at the Burke.
So to begin our work, Anna and Danielle asked if I would come in and help the kids learn about the systems of language. And I chose this schematic, which is old, Watson, Burke, and Goodman from the 80s, because it was very concrete. And we were working with 12 and 13-year-olds, and we wanted to make things as concrete as we could. So as we could talk about meaning and how it's inscribed on the grammar and what does a simple sound do, we could use real life examples, and then they could talk about it. Interestingly enough, I used the same set of slides later with my college students and found that Anna and Danielle's kids did just as well as my college students did with this whole concept. In fact, they asked better questions, to be honest, and their participation was fabulous. But I think no one had ever told them information about reading, about what reading is. I think it was brand new to them. And then when you add, what are you thinking when you read? That's even more new to them. So they were very intrigued. As we taught this, I would teach it in one class, and then the teachers would teach it the rest of the day to the rest of the classes. But we emphasized that everyone miscues, and we had students who just swore that was not true. Mm-hmm. No, not everyone miscues. We talked a little bit about high and low quality miscues and got them ready for that. And then we challenged kids to be, I think Yetta and Ken used to call it be miscuteers, to really start listening for miscues in their world. And that's when things got really interesting.
And in looking back on our findings and looking back on our study, I realize now that the revaluing began on this day one of our study, because Carol, one of the first things she said to our students, to my students, was, this is a presentation I do with college students, so it's like you're going to college right now today. And I remember there were students who sat up for the first time in class and paid attention. When we challenge our students to become miscuteers, we, from the beginning, asked them to become miscue detectives. And so I made a handout that said, you're a miscue detective now. For the next 24 hours, find as many miscues as you can in real life when people are making them. And we had students who came back and said, the shop teacher, when she was reading the instructions, she made a miscue. And another student came in and said, well, my mom was reading that recipe out loud to us at dinner, and she almost put the wrong ingredient in because she made a miscue. And it really started to shift the focus from what am I doing, what mistakes am I making, to, wow, let me be this miscue detective. And one of the things that happened around that time was, I don't know if you remember this or not, but Steve Harvey in the Miss Universe pageant announced that Miss Columbia won the Miss Universe pageant. And then, like, in the course of the pageant, the crown was put on Miss Columbia, she was given the flowers, and Steve came back on stage and said, I'm really sorry, but I made a mistake and I said the wrong name. And my students and I talked about how everybody miscues, and we were still dealing with students who were saying, no, that's not true. Only people in this class miscue. And I found that video, but I also found an interview where Steve Harvey said, oh, no, the card said that Miss Philippines won, but I read it as Miss Columbia won. And so we shared that with students, and we called it the most famous miscue in the world. Carol brought in some baseball articles. And one of the most powerful things was that our rivals, Danielle's school, was doing this work at the same time that we were doing this work. And so my students were hungry for stories from across town and what was successful for them, because if it were successful for them, we would make it more successful at our school. So we started to teach our students about marking, and I have to say right here that not everything went smoothly. That there were times that we stumbled, and some of our learning out of that was very eye-opening. And so when marking wasn't going great in Danielle's class, she had the idea of, well, let me, as I'm reading and my students are marking my miscues, let me give them a highlighter and they'll just highlight before we do the markings. And that was very successful, that students started to attend to the miscues just by highlighting. They did not have to have the correct miscue marking at that moment. They just needed to recognize that there was a miscue. We taught types of miscues, high quality and low quality. We gave students a very small chart that included the markings for substitutions, omissions, insertions, self-corrections, and repetitions. We practiced. We would take small pieces of text at first, and I, as a teacher, would read and make miscues, and then students would mark those miscues. And then we would debrief about those miscues, and we would talk about, about the word in the context of the paragraph that I was reading. And so I would do with my students, because we tried to keep this fun and engaging for our students. I would do high quality miscues and make my voice very high and raise my hand above my head. And then I would lower my hand if it were a low quality miscue, and I would make my voice deeper and I would say low quality. And the kids really enjoyed that. In Danielle's class, she called them high Q.
The kids called. The kids just immediately said, "Oh, those are HQ and LQ," and that's what they call them. There's an HQ one, and okay, I mean, they made it their own. They owned it. The other thing that Danielle did that was interesting was her kids. She thought they were still feeling a little stigma about this miscue stuff. So there was an 8th grader who had gone through her program and who had been dismissed and who was very popular. He was like an athlete. And so she asked him if he would come in and do a reading for her class and her kids would mark his miscues. And he said, sure, because he was popular and he didn't, he had nothing to hide. And these were just little 6th graders. It was fine with him. So he came in, this big, tall athlete, and he read a piece cold. And although he had fabulous comprehension, he still miscued frequently. And the kids were just like in awe of him and then got to mark all the miscues that he did. And so again, it just normalized everyone miscues. You're not odd for miscuing. Everybody does it.
And as we moved into CRMA, we provided students with pairs of articles from Newsela. They were about 300, 350 words. We prepared packets. And so we would have 2 copies of the article on color-coded paper, so that one student could read and one student could mark, and then partners would switch and they would practice retelling to each other. We also played games, including the high quality and low quality, and then sorting. And we actually had to play games where students were not encouraged to make miscues, but we were trying to destigmatize this idea of making miscues, because I had students who would do an RMA conference from across the room. I had one student who would not come sit near me until I would say the 3rd or 4th RMA conference I had with him. So we had some real trust issues where we were really trying to build trust with our students and to normalize that everyone miscues. This is a checklist we provided students. We wanted students to be as independent with their partners as possible. And in some classes that was difficult. In some classes, I would be with a group, Carol would be with a group, and my student teacher would be with a group. But in other classes, the partners could work independently and follow the steps. And so you'll see the steps here that students would read the article while one partner records. Students were also recording themselves during this time. And then the partner would ask for a retelling. And sometimes role play was involved. The students told us one day that, oh, it's kind of like one of us gets to be the teacher and the other one gets to be the reader. And then we get to switch and change roles. And then usually students would get to about step 3 in one class period. And then the next day they would listen to their miscues, their recording that they had made the day before, and check Both partners would check miscues, and then they would fill out a CRMA organizer that's on the next slide. And then they would we really wanted them to focus on the questions at the bottom of this organizer. What were you thinking as you read? What was your brain doing?
Keep going.
Okay. And so this is the organizer that students, would use. And they would also ask themselves, did the miscue change meaning? Yes or no?
So what we found out from these students is, first of all, they learned a great deal very quickly about miscue analysis, really surprised us how quickly they could learn. And secondly, they stopped doing what we were calling fake reading. That's when they've read the same book 6 times, or they're just letting their mind look at the words and their minds are totally somewhere else. They were really engaged in it. And they were also very metacognitive. So we have a couple of stories for you about those students. And I think you can see from the stories about the kinds of knowledge that they took from this and the kinds of change in their behavior. And also how they surprised us. They did things that we just didn't expect, that were just really amazing. So Anna, tell some stories.
So I'll start with a story about Bahar and Janice. These students were ELL students. Bahar was from Bulgaria, I think. And Janice was she was a Latinx student, Spanish speaker. And they were partners, and we were very worried about them at the beginning of our study because we were incredibly intentional about the partnering that I did with the students. And we found that there was some friction between Bahar and Janice. And one day I stopped in on their partnership and started talking to them, and Janice said, Bahar marks everything I say as a miscue. Everything. Well, Bahar was marking everything Janice said as a miscue when they were actually dialect. It was dialect. And luckily, in one of my other classes, Carol's book was sitting on the table, and I had this student who was just so interested in what we were doing in the markings. And he had taken her book one day and he had told the whole class, he had announced to the whole class, did you know that there's a marking for dialect? That it's not a miscue if somebody says a word and they pronounce it a little bit differently than you do. And so I had a talk with them. We talked about dialect, and their partnership became a lot smoother as that went along. Bahar was incredibly interesting because Bahar said things to us about, could I think about what my brain is doing when I'm at track practice? Mm-hmm. Could I think about what my brain is doing when I'm reading in other languages? And so that was incredibly interesting. Ella and Mary were 2 students who were incredibly disengaged when my class started that year. Getting them to read even the shortest piece of text was very difficult. As we were reading the articles that we chose from News ELA to actually engage them and interest them, they were reading one day and they were reading about Barbie body image and also black hair. And I looked over and the 2 of them had gone over to my computer and they were researching other articles on their own. And that to me was an example of.
Yeah, it's so interesting because that seems to say that these kids who had never really extended their own learning, at least at school, and suddenly now they feel compelled to go borrow her computer to kind of find more information. They're digging for more information. And I think the other thing it says is that Anna's classroom had become so democratized, so liberatory, that was an okay thing to do. They didn't have to ask her if they could borrow the computer. They didn't have to wait for a free day. They could go when they needed it, and it was fine with her. It was part of what happened in that classroom. So I think it told us a lot.
And Ava was probably my most changed student. It was really interesting when I started RMA with Ava. She was an incredibly quiet, shy student. And we saw so much growth in her over the 2 years. She went from being this very quiet, shy student to actually being a class leader. She would bring back stories and tell the class about how her family made a room, a library for her because she was now so interested in reading, and her mom found a secondhand bookshelf for her and a comfortable chair, and how her family would actually help her with her reading. One thing that was interesting, she had a book, she was reading El Chapo in Spanish, and in a later RMA conference, she said, "Can I bring this book with me?" And at the beginning of this study, before we did this study, I would have been very reluctant because I do not speak Spanish, and I would have had no idea how to respond to her. And in that particular RMA conference, I think I pretty much just circled the word if it was a miscue. And then after her retelling, I would say to her, "So what was your brain doing? I heard a miscue right here. What was your brain doing?" And we had a wonderful conversation about what her brain was doing at that time.
I think we're just about out of time, but one of the things that happened at the end of the year when teachers had to do the DRA again, this was Luke, and he was, I think, in Danielle's class, and they were doing the DRA, and she was marking, and suddenly Luke looked up at her and said, "Excuse me, I just made a substitution. I don't think you marked it." And that really said to us that this had taken the mystery out of testing for these kids. They understood the game that was being played when testing was happening, and they knew how to play it. So that gave them incredible agency and incredible confidence when that testing came. So let's just go to the end slide.
This one?
This is a picture of all of Anna's kids engaged in, not all of them, but many of them engaged in CRMA. And our article in Talking Points is there. And then we have 2 articles in Reclaiming Literacies as Meaning Making. And I think our time is gone.
Thank you. Let's see. I'm going to stop your sharing. Thank you, Carol and Anna. That was amazing. The chat was saying how truly astounding what you're doing with kids in terms of letting them in on the mystery of reading and demystifying the reading process. But the kind of the flip from teacher to student to teacher, thinking of the power relationships that are happening in the classroom in these conversations is powerful. There was a question about whether there are published studies of CRMA. And I think, did you send me some articles for the Dropbox? So we have some in there.
Yeah, I sent you one, and then the Reclaiming Literacy, our stuff is in there. And yeah, there are getting to be more CRMA articles out.
And the amazing thing about retrospective miscue analysis studies in general, although they are case studies typically, the changes in kids and just in terms of the kinds of strategies they're able to articulate from the beginning to the end are just astounding and consistent across all of these studies. So we will post some in the Dropbox. So welcome back, everybody. And I popped into the concurrent sessions and was very sorry that I couldn't see all of them. I'm sure that you all felt the same way, but it's been a very rich day. And by now, you know that you are among educational activists, if you didn't know before you started. And so we've asked Bess Altwerger and Rick Meyer, our friends and colleagues, to inspire us all with the continuing revolution at our closing session. You're on.
Thank you, Deborah and Alan. Thanks for inviting us. I wish this was a conversation with all of us sitting around my dining room table, because that's more of what I'm used to, especially having grown up a lot as an educator in Ken and Yetta's living room and kitchens and offices and so on. This very much is intended to be a conversation, but we're calling it a guided conversation because Bess and I have met quite a bit to try to frame how we were going to go about it. So it is a conversation between the two of us, and we have allotted room at the end for you to talk about your ideas, your input, your questions, your curiosities.
So Rick and I have noticed through the years how much we have in common. And one of the most important things we have in common is that we were both immediately drawn to Ken and Yetta's model. We saw the revolutionary potential almost immediately in when we first came across Ken's work and miscue analysis and his way of thinking about what reading was. And I think there's a reason for that. We were both already activists in college, and we brought similar values and criticality to looking at that work.
So one thing we want to do to help provoke your thinking is we put a question in the chat, something, if that helps guide your thinking as we work our way through the conversation, that's fine. If not, if it goes in your own direction, that's fine too. Both of us really came to Ken's work from broader context in which we were both activists. I was an activist in the civil rights movement and very much active in the anti-war movement. I suffered greatly and had many challenges as a conscientious objector. I fought for students' rights. And even further back, when I was 14 years old, I took my first trip from New York to Washington, D.C., where I protested the lack of allowing Soviet Jewish refugees to come to the United States. And when I started teaching, I was very friendly with Arlene Fingerette, who started the Education Warehouse in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And even though I was in New York, we had known each other for many years. And I went to the Education Warehouse, and there was Paulo Freire. That was during his time in Cambridge, and they had, the day I was there, they had the page proofs from Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And so I was very much a political person before and as I was becoming a teacher.
Yeah, that's amazing. I know I read Freire much later. I read Freire the first year of graduate school, and I remember Barbara and I talked about it a lot. The other thing we had in common, and we were very, very lucky about this, is that we became teachers in a different era. It was the era of open classroom. I mean, I did my student teaching in the Little Red Schoolhouse, completely open school. I know Rick did the same. The curriculum was based on the kids. It was about inquiry. We allowed the kids to choose what they read, not only choose what they read, but when they were ready to read. The math groups, if there were any, were self-determined. On the other hand, we both worked with low-income kids and kids that are often marginalized in school and who believe they're not readers. And Ken's work made us both, I think, see in our kids that they had the power to become readers. The socio-psycholinguistic model of reading just resonated with us. And given that we were both reading teachers at some point, it really changed our own pedagogy. We might have had the activism piece, but we didn't yet see until Ken's model how it got translated in terms of reading literacy pedagogy. But we both looked at, the lens that we used as we looked at Ken's work was this awareness of cultural, economic, and racial oppression. It was always in the background.
And we could bring that into our classrooms. And so for me, I was still very much a classroom teacher when I started going to whole language umbrella conferences. And what Ken gave me but even before I was in graduate school with him and Yetta was sort of a permission to bring the two worlds of my life to let them overlap in my own classroom. So the greater criticality that I had for broader contexts like war and poverty and classism and racism and genderism, those are now welcome in my classroom because I have to pay attention to who's in my classroom, what issues they're facing, and what my responsibility, my moral and ethical responsibility was to do about that in my classroom. And I taught young children for almost 20 years before I moved down to higher education. And it was really important to me that I had classrooms in which children's identities mattered, and the fullness that whole language afforded me was just this wonderful lifting off of this weight of basals and tests and crazy stuff that started to be imposed on us as teachers.
You know, and I think that a lot of people become politicized from Ken's model and from whole language. And whole language sparks in them a more critical perspective. And a lot of people, and probably a lot of people in this room, were not political prior to taking a look at Ken's stuff, didn't think critically about their pedagogy and the politics of their pedagogy. But it can also go in the other direction, where you're coming from the activist world and you see in Ken's work that incredible potential. And so Rick and I, started to think about how we can bring a political perspective to whole language. And it wasn't just me and Rick, it was Carol Edelsky for sure, Barbara Flores, so many other people that are sitting in this room. And I don't want to leave out anybody, but you know who you are. And we started like 25 years ago, even doing a political pre-convention institute for whole language umbrella. Ken did the first one. And then I kind of, carried the baton forward. And I partnered with several different people in this group, more recently with Rick, the last at least decade. I've been partnering with Rick to do that. And we'll talk a little bit more about our work in USOS, which was Save Our Schools, and its connection to whole language. But I'll leave that there for now and come back to it.
And I think it's important to make public that we were critical of documents like the one that Steve talked about earlier by Klein and Rice. And even earlier, documents like A Nation at Risk, because we saw through those pieces for what they really were, which was corporate thinking, extending into and controlling education. A Nation at Risk blamed education for economic troubles in the United States, but we knew and we know that it's capitalism and capitalistic greed that drives that kind of thinking and also perpetuates racism and classism. Naomi Klein talks about this as the shock doctrine, where fear tactics are used to provoke people into doing things they don't want to do and to drain their energy. And then after that, when Becoming a Nation of Readers was published, we critiqued it because of the way that it celebrated basal readers as a form of equity, which it was absolutely not. It was just making everybody white.
Right. And ever since then, there's been more and more documents that have come down from the government, all shaped by a corporate model, a class model of society that separates all of us and creates different layers and levels of education within the school. But all of this is very much connected. Rick, you want to talk a little bit about your notion of intersectionality?
So what we realized as we were planning what we wanted to spontaneously discuss with everybody, we realized that we were trying to condense 50 years of being educators into a very brief period of time. And we kept saying, well, yeah, and this too, and this too, and this is related to it. And what it brought to my mind was when I was a second grade teacher, we would every now and then do this exercise with a ball of yarn where all the second graders would stand in a circle and one of them would hold a ball of yarn. So for example, if we were talking about nature, one of the kids would say, well, I would say, what's something in nature? And one of the kids might say the sun. And so she would start with the end of the ball of yarn and then toss it or roll it to another kid in the circle and they would pick it up. Well, if we're talking about nature, we have to talk about trees. And they would hold that piece and then roll it or throw it to somebody else. And they would say, well, what about bugs? And then they would roll it to somebody else and say, yeah, but what about big animals? And what about water? And what about air? And then we would wind up with this human-made web of yarn. And then I would say things like, well, let's just let go of the sun and see what happens. And you could see the way everything was connected to everything else. Well, that's Crenshaw's idea of intersectionality. And we think of our political work as very much around this intersectional model because there are so many moving pieces. And so even in our own classrooms, well, we're a teacher. And if you were at Carol Crowell's session, she's a teacher working with a kid in her classroom, in her school, in a community, in a district, in a state, in a country, on a planet, all these intersected pieces. And they also intersect with things like global economies and wealth distribution, class and race. So the bigness of political work can tend to sort of blow up our brains. But rather than that, what we choose to do is try to focus. And as you'll see, we've even developed some documents to focus our political work in a way that honors the intersection between politics, power, control, teachers, kids, and communities.
So, you know, a teacher, all of us as teachers might be in our classrooms and we kind of physically, we're just in a classroom ourselves and our students. But if it's important to see that in a sense, every classroom is a microcosm of the larger society, and that every child reflects all kinds of factors that have impacted them in their lives. So you may be teaching reading to a child or helping children learn to read, and that child is interacting with you, but what they're bringing with them and what impacts your pedagogy and what impacts the student's response to learning has to do with all kinds of societal factors that are embedded outside of your classroom and then reflected in. For example, food insecurity. Do the children have food insecurity? Have they seen violence in the streets? Are they living dangerously? Are they homeless? And those things cannot be changed by what you do in your classroom. What has to happen is we need to change the system that is exerting itself on the kids in our classroom. We can respond to them. We can understand them. We could help them to navigate that. But as teachers, what Rick and I came to realize is that we cannot ignore the broader context that children are bringing into that classroom and that is being reflected in the kind of school system we have, because that system is living in a larger system. And in our country, that is a class system. It's capitalism, and it has to do with profit and power.
And so this is the point in our planning when I started to say, oh, and this, and Beth started to say, and this, and this. And so what we're going to do now is each of us is going to take a little bit bigger chunk of time and talk about our ideas. And my ideas start within the classroom as the point of origin, uh, all situated in that broader context. And Bess is going to come back and view it as, okay, let's start from the outside and look in. So here's my piece from the classroom perspective, or from the educator and child perspective. When I think of the revolution that Ken really started, I actually went to Google before this conversation to look up, well, what really is a revolution? And the first definition is movement around a given point, like planets revolving around the sun. And then the second one was an abrupt change. And I thought Ken's revolution was both. Because rather than reading revolving around a word or a sound, it revolves around meaning. And that's revolutionary. And what I want to try to do is try to unpack some of the ideas of why this abrupt change, this cosmic shift, is indeed revolutionary. And one of the ways it's revolutionary, in my mind, is that it's challenging and threatening to things the way they are. So when we start to consider some of the deeper impacts of Ken's research on reading, many of the ideas that you saw at this conference, it's important to understand that increased knowledge about literacy learning is a threat to power and control structures that are in place, not only in our schools, but in our broader society. So how can that be? Well, one, think about the position of the learner. If you were at even Carol Gillis's presentation, Carol Kroll's presentation, the child has moved from the position of being an empty slate that the teacher writes on to being an informant about what that child knows. That is a threat to many people's view of what a child is supposed to be, which is compliant and empty and docile. And further, to pick up on what Carol Edelsky started to talk about last night, about meaning making being unique to children, what whole language does and what Ken's theory does is undoes the idea of some kids' meanings are to be denied, because historically that's what's happened in schools. Certain kids' dialects, their interpretations of stories, their views about life are systematically denied by a system that demands compliance rather, and being well behaved. And then look at the position of an informed teacher as a threat. That really challenges the idea of teachers should be compliant and follow the curriculum that they're told to do, follow the Basel company's boxes that you're sent. So this is a threat to those in power and control. People like Basel corporations, the science of reading people that Steve alluded to, called out earlier today, test publishers, the people who abuse test results. Ken's theory calls all that out. It also challenges the idea of disability, because a disability is defined in terms of normalcy. And when kids are put at the center, then what normal is gets challenged because it's not predefined. And think of the way administrators are and administrations of schools, including school boards, can be threatened when informed teachers want to change or even disrupt some of the regularities of school, like the use of time and where curriculum comes from, and what happens if curriculum is child-centered, and what happens when we challenge things that seem to be common sense. And Ken's theory challenges the common sense model of reading. Oh, I have to stop and take a breath. So curriculum itself can be threatening when we start to listen to children and build curriculum on their curiosities and their needs and their demands, and we have increased criticality. Then we see things like Carol Kroll's third graders deciding not to play war on the playground anymore. Or we see high school students in New Bedford, Massachusetts, that Bess and I were lucky enough to meet just a few months ago, engaged in transformational learning outside of the school because the school won't provide it. Or in Tucson, we see Curtis Acosta and his students demanding, and now across the country, demanding ethnic studies programs. We see second graders challenging what is being sold to them by the media. We see the movement for Black lives grow into the movement for Black lives in schools, because when Brian talked last night about preserving democracy, we're now talking about making a democracy that is indeed equitable, fair, and humane and decent. And that's what we've been fighting for. So Red Nation Youth and others, and Movement for Black Lives, developing into Movement for Black Lives in schools. This comes from putting the learner at the center. That means authentic inquiry and uncovering ideas and knowledge rather than covering some curriculum. So that's a lot, but there's even more. And I'm going to stop and let Bess pick it up, and then we'll bounce back and forth. But think even about language. Denny Taylor talked about languages and 7,000 languages across the world. And yet languages are being extinguished. And that is systematic, and I would argue even planned. English colonizes places the way globalism colonizes places. So school is always a political context, even if a teacher follows curriculum by the letter, by the Basel letter. That is a political statement. Compliance is a political stance. In this case, one that perpetuates power, control, economics, racial inequities. But when children are encouraged to transact with and transform their lived experiences in schools, then inequities are challenged. And I'll just finish with this. Whole language not was, is a grassroots political movement. It started with teachers talking to one another, much akin to the way Cesar Chavez said, you want to start a revolution? Talk to each other. The peaceful revolution is up to all of us, to us as teachers, activists, and Bess is now going to talk about the broader context in which all that occurs.
Well, thanks, Rick. That was great. You know, I think all of us who were embracing whole language and saw at one point it growing and taking on a life of its own, we hoped that we could, and we still hope that it will have a democratizing effect on not just the kids, as Carol Gillis was talking about, liberatory pedagogy, you know, liberating the children, but creating a new vision of what a democratic school can be in a democratic classroom. The fact that we had such pushback speaks to the kind of threat that Rick was just talking about, that whole language poses. And who is it? We need to ask, who is it that is so threatened by whole language? Who has to loses? Who actually loses from whole language and who gains from it? And we have to recognize that we are up against a power system that is pushing against us and will continue pushing against us until we make some changes to the broader system. We have an economic system that benefits from making sure that whole language does not flourish and does not become the lay of the land. back in the 90s, early 90s, we noticed that the National Business Roundtable was exerting itself on education policy. And Steve alluded to this earlier in his session, that they not only saw their profitability being challenged by whole language, because we don't have to spend the fortune on the basals. We don't have to spend the fortune on the standardized tests and the testing industry. Not only did they see their profitability being threatened, but they also wanted to take the reins of public education so they could create a workforce in the future that they saw as globally competitive. That means that they had to have a certain number of kids become the engineers, become the people who run the corporations and who determine policy. But they also have to have a layer of kids that aren't going to do that. In other words, they needed to make sure that they reproduced a class society with only a certain percentage of kids at the top and the rest of us at the middle or at the bottom. Just like we talk about the 1% and the 99% in terms of our economic structure and the range that we have in this country of economic wealth. It's reflected in what percentage of kids make it at the top of that system and what percentages of kids do not. So we cannot ignore the larger corporate structure, the larger system of capitalism that's exerting itself on public education. The National Business Roundtable, later ALEC, all of the policies that it pushed and that made sure that it got instituted were to benefit their current and their future global economic power, and to maintain the status quo. And included in that is making sure that the social and racial inequities that occur in the larger society continues to divide the working class through school. We are going to, through this systemic racism that permeates our public school system, it continues to make sure that racism and all kinds of isms divide the working class and keep them in power. So as we began to understand this, that we can only go so far in democratizing schools and democratizing the society through our working classrooms, through whole language, and through instituting our understanding of reading that is truly liberatory. We began to realize that if we're true education activists, we have to go beyond.
So let me just add one tiny vignette that really brought this home for me and totally convinced me of everything Bess is saying. When I do research, it's always in schools with kids, with teachers, sometimes with their families. And I try to live whatever the teachers' lives are during that time. So when there's a professional development, I go to it. And afterwards we'll talk about it and dissect it, question it, interrogate it. Well, I was at one of those professional developments, and it was about the new reading system that the district just adopted. I call it the flavor of the week. And they had just adopted it. And some of the teachers that were in my study group, and I would never do this because I'm an outsider, but some of the teachers raised their hand and started to ask some really good questions about the program that was going to be instituted. And very dramatically, the professional developer walked over to a chart board and flipped over to a new page and said, "We'll call this the parking lot. And we'll put your questions in the parking lot about what your concerns are and your curiosities about the program." Well, 3 hours later, when she was wrapping up and there was maybe a minute left, I did raise my hand and I said, "This has been very informative today, and it's important to consider a lot of the things that you're saying. But one thing I would suggest is change the name of the parking lot to the cemetery, because that's where you tell teachers ideas to go die." And then I left. I was livid, but I thought, there it is, that signifier of perpetuating control over teachers and teachers as a conduit for control over children. And then we sat around to deconstruct that professional development, and the teachers were exhausted. And I realized their souls are being sucked out of them. And the larger system is what's imposing itself, which is why what Bess is saying is so central to the futures of our work. And you'll see we even developed a platform for a future president that we're going to get to in a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of you know that back in really starting in 2010, and I don't know if Jesse is still here, Jesse Turner, and several of us here, Debbie was involved, Rick of course was involved, and please forgive me if I forgot to mention your name, but many of us in CELT and in the whole language world started to feel an urgency to not just work within our classrooms and within our own schools, but begin to help create a movement, a larger national movement for change. And we called, and actually it comes from Ken's book, Saving Our Schools. We decided to call this action, this movement we were going to start, Save Our Schools. And in 2011, oh, wow. Thank you, David. Yay, SOS Arizona. In 2011, we had the first major education protest in Washington, D.C. It was an amazing, inspiring event. It was a conference, it was a march, it was everything. It was
we did
amazing.
A film festival, we did activism training for a full day.
That's right.
We did a post rally and march Congress to formulate ideas for what would come next. And maybe Bess will talk about some of the groups that grew out of that movement.
Well, if any of you have heard about United Opt-out, the National Network for Public Education, Badass Teachers Association, that all came from Save Our Schools and that initial March on Washington and conference and Congress and so forth. We had another one in 2016. But what I'd really like to touch on is how those of us in that movement have evolved even further than the demands that we were making then, which were all education-based. We've now kind of morphed into what we're calling uniting to save our schools. Alan, can you show the first slide?
Well, Alan's bringing that up. I just want to back up to the 2016 event that we held, because in some ways it was really groundbreaking in that we decided and realized the urgency of including many, many groups within our work. So we really became coalition minded. And what really rose to the top for us was the lack of racial diversities in our work. And so we held the event at Howard University. White people were very much in the minority. It was saturated with young diverse kids, youth of color who were involved in movements all around, up and down pretty much the East Coast. And that commitment was inspiring and led to the idea of Uniting to Save Our Schools, because we realized we need a broader platform. It needs to be inclusive of multiple diversities, ages, genders, races, obviously classes, so that quite honestly, we don't look so much the way this room looks right now, which is very filled with white people. Now, that's not bad. I mean, I'm one of them. I'm trying to be okay. And there are a lot of people who are suffering who are not represented in our work. And realizing that drove us even further to think of a broader platform that was much more inclusive.
You know, and we also realized that we had to go beyond education and reach out to community organizing groups and other activists outside of education. We partnered with Journey for Justice. They came to the conference and played a very large role. And the Poor People's Campaign was present. And that is key. We cannot change education, and we cannot make changes, broader, more important educations towards justice in this country by just speaking to each other. Educators need to reach out and make links to activists that are working in many different areas.
And we reached out and we went to Selma for the Bridge Jubilee.
Yeah.
And we were invited to present, which was wonderful, but mostly it was about connecting and developing relationships with people across diverse groups to make sure that we're all included in a united platform for a truly equitable and not a race-based democracy.
Right. So Alan, can you go to the next slide? Oh, this is, by the way, if you, maybe somebody can put it in the chat also. Uniting to Save Our Schools has a Facebook page, and of course, we have a website that you're invited to not just visit, but that Facebook page, we invite you to friend it or like it or whatever it is, and post events and things that are happening in your area that other activists want to know about. Okay, so the next slide, Alan.
We are on Twitter and Instagram too,
Oh,
except Betsy and I don't know anything about those. So we don't know how to put up a little bird or anything else. But if you're on Twitter and Instagram and you know about those things, you can find us Uniting to Save Our Schools.
So we developed a platform for public education, and we're going to tell you a little bit about it. But we also have, if you go to our website, suggested actions, because we don't want this to be an organization that just is on paper. We want people to be active in their communities and to join with other activists to make the difference. I think this is key, in our preamble to our platform, we say that in order to transform public education, we must work to eliminate all forms of human exploitation, including, including systematic, Alan, okay, racism, as well as existing inequities in healthcare, housing, jobs, food security, and the environment. Creating a public education system that is anti-racist, equitable, democratic, and humane will require fundamental changes to the institutions of power and wealth that benefit the few at the expense of the many. So next slide, Alan.
And this document is really, this document is really organic, and we've been changing it as we go along, as we learn more. Now, I think we'll add something about voter suppression and voter access, because that's becoming a real issue. You can't have a democracy if people can't have legitimate and authentic voice in a way that's reliable and fair. And so this next slide shows 8 bullets of, these are the big umbrella items. What our process was with many colleagues and friends was this huge brainstorming activity of what needs to be included if we're going to develop a platform for the next president. And a platform that truly supports a a humanistic and decent, humane democracy. And so we're not going to read them all to you. You can read them as we're talking, but these were the big areas. And what Bess wanted to do today was to take one and show you in some depth the importance of it. And we're also getting to some actions that we have taken, including action dialogues. You're all invited to see those. They're archived on our website, as well as one coming up May 3rd that we'll talk about. We've done a variety of topics. The suggested actions that are on the website is 17 pages long to inspire people to take one. Even if you do a book group with around a book that's contentious, you're involved. You're doing USOS work. But here are some of the big ideas.
And I just also want to emphasize, this is not, I see these, and I know Rick, you do too, not just important during election time, and maybe not even as, I can't imagine any current, what I consider corporate parties, both either the Democrats or the Republicans, embracing all of this. This goes way beyond. This is supposed to inspire us to action, because I think true change only occurs when regular people make their voices heard, get out in the street and do what has to be done. So if you go to the next slide, Alan. We just want to illuminate one of these, which is number 4, strong school communities and families. And I know I can't run through all this. And you do have, I think Alan and Debbie sent out or put in some kind of Google Drive or something, this whole platform.
Right.
But what I want to point out here is that this is not, these demands, so to speak, are not education specific, but they are calling for changes in society that will enable us to have the kind of school system and classrooms that we want. So it's
if you take any one of these bullets, how many of us as teachers have said, look at the second bullet, how many of us as teachers have said, he would be doing so much better in school if he didn't come to school with toothaches and earaches every day. She would be doing so much better in school if we had counselors here and we knew that her psychological health care was taken care of. Or when you look at any one of these, support local and family-owned and racially diverse businesses. Think of, if especially those of us who work in very vulnerable or fragile communities, like in New Mexico, that includes the reservations. If we could change those to a point where there was economic security, it changes the whole dynamic of what happens in school. To me, this is a more accurate list of school readiness issues, if you want to think about school readiness, than saying, oh, she knows the letters of the alphabet. Well, who knows the letters of the alphabet? Kids who read all these bullets. Their families are fully employed. They have medical and dental. So there's time for family to have more school-based or academic kind of interactions with kids, or just read and share books together. And so that's why when Beth says this is fundamental to our schools, when you read each bullet, it's like, well, yeah, just think of our own classrooms. Yeah, of course.
And we know that not everybody is able to get out there and demonstrate and push for all of these very, very important changes to society. But what we need is to have people working outside and people working inside the school system to make the changes that we need. You know, so many of our kids have parents that are incarcerated. That's a form of family separation. How do you sit there as a child and concentrate when you know you're not going to see your parent for years, and that you don't know where your next meal is coming from? We have to recognize that when police walk around in schools, these SROs in our schools, that's threatening. We believe that we have to have community-based policing, not not a police force that is the enemy of the people, that is chosen by the community and is controlled by the community.
And to look at
So-
justice, and to look at justice in terms of to look at justice in terms of restorative justice and
Right.
transformative justice rather than punishment, punishment, punishment. We know what that does. Since slavery, we've known what that does because that's where it was invented. And it's time for us to move away from those models that lead to deteriorating communities, the way Deborah Goodman describes Detroit on her first day of teaching. And that's what builds strong schools. And Beth said something very quickly I want to come back to. She said, we can't do it all. And when you're in your classroom, find a little piece. That's really true. I'm a big believer in what Leonard Cohen says in his song poem Anthem. Find a crack where the light gets in and take advantage of that crack, that moment in time. If you're in a very oppressive school situation and you have chosen to stay there for the sake of children, even I would argue sacrificing yourself to some degree, find places where there's a crack that lets the light in so that you can say, yeah, we did this. We had a great discussion about what's unfair, or we even had a great discussion of how crappy the cafeteria food is and why can't we do something about that?
Right. We invite you to join some of our, what we call action dialogues. We've all, this year we've had several already, on one on police-free schools, on canceling the tests and opting out, on where we're about to have one on social justice unionism. And I want to end with this. This summer, what we hope to do is take on, in our way, the science of reading, not to argue with those folks, not to try to challenge them specifically, but to reframe our work in literacy as liberatory literacy and build a momentum amongst parents and teachers and students to work toward a liberatory literacy. I do not think that we should waste our time. You know, if you have the energy for it, fine. I never talk to those science of reading people. It's a waste of time, in my opinion. We need to build a new frame. We need to build a new idea of what literacy should be. And of course, it incorporates all of this work that we've done in whole language. Ken lives in this work, Yetta lives in this work, and will continue to live in that work. But let's move forward. Let's change the picture, change the national dialogue.
I totally agree. It's nice. We're on the same page, which is fun. So do join us. We have about a minute for questions, thoughts, responses, ideas. But don't be depressed. It's very overwhelming when you see how oppressive the world can be. It's like we have to find the crack. For me, sometimes the crack is when I call Bess and say, what the hell are we going to do about, and that's where the light gets in that day. That's what keeps us going. We are a grassroots movement and we need light to grow, and we are each other's light. So thoughts, ideas, responses to the opening questions.
There are a lot of comments in the chat. Does anyone want to, just
what's the website?
Can you unmute everybody?
What's the website? What's the website?
Okay, it's just www.unitingtosaveourschools.org. And we're on Facebook. You want to go back to that first slide, Alan? It has the Facebook page on it.
Okay.
Okay. Steve, as long as you're still here, crashing. We also have, and Stephanie Furr is here. We also have a Facebook page that tries to kind of support each other in new research and new ideas, new documents, and that's called Literacy research and policy. Am I getting that right?
So,
Literacy, research, and policy change. I'll look it up.
I put the website in the chat, and I'll put the Facebook page in the chat. Will that allow people to choose it? I know it's a closed group.
Stephanie, can you put the Facebook, just put it in the chat box, please?
Yeah.
Our literacy page.
any other thoughts or?
So maybe Stephanie, if you could put your, however they would contact you. Because it's a page where people can talk freely. So
Sorry, guys. Yes,
without being, what do you call that?
Haven't
Hacked.
I haven't put my comments on the page on my chat because I can't reach. I don't know how to handle that. But I just want to ask Bess and Steve, and I want to discuss this with you further. And that is, how do we bring the word curriculum back into the discussion of schooling? I think the term has been, perhaps given what Steve said, purposely kicked out of schools. Because as we've looked for pedagogy, we've talked about kids being involved in the development of their own curriculum. We've gotten rid of that term. I think it's a term that's hard to replace. And so unless we can find another term for that, I think we've got to deal with the term itself.
I really agree with that. The word curriculum has been completely appropriated. And when you have enough money and political power and clout, you can steal words. And it's hard to take words back. I mean, the word gay has been reappropriated. So it used to be a put down and everything else. And yet the LGBTQI, et cetera, community reappropriated that word and said, screw you, you can't have it. And that was profound and powerful that happened. So figuring out for ourselves how to do that is part of strategizing.
Next one, sorry. Keep going. I want to show Yetta that it's definitely part of our platform, engaging and comprehensive classroom instruction for every child. And under that is a whole bunch of stuff on curriculum. What should be included in the curriculum, that the child is the center of the curriculum, that we need to look at the whole child, that it has to be holistic, inquiry-based. It's all in there. We need to include that. I agree. We need to really stop thinking about curriculum as a commodity, as something that you buy and sell, and something that is organic and emerges from the children who you're sitting in front of or with.
And that goes back to Brian's metaphors about the learning as acquisition, and that is commodification, because when you acquire a shirt, you buy it. When you acquire a curriculum, you buy it, and you use both the same way. You put them on and they're a standard thing. And that's exactly what we're not in favor of.
And everything gets turned into that because it's profit. They're going to make profit out of it. They're going to be able to control us with it. So there's a definite intention there in co-opting what curriculum is.
Because it perpetuates the class status as it is.
Right.
So,
I think we're out of time, Deborah, according
I
to.
think we're out of time, yes. It's hard to say goodbye. Yes, thank you so much to Rick and to Bess for these comments. As I think, you know, if we could plan our ideal conference, we'd have time for everyone to talk. But we got such outstanding response from the selective group that we asked to present at this conference. Everybody said yes, that we wanted to reserve as much time as possible for us to hear their wonderful studies and thoughts. Rick and Bess, I think one of the things you'd agree on is, and that you exemplify, is that you also need a friend if you're going to do this liberatory educational activism. You need a friend. It's hard to do it by yourself, if not impossible. You know, I found in academia too, that too many times I'm out on the limb and somebody's sawing it behind me and I'm there by myself and not with my colleagues. So my colleagues are smiling at me, Riley. I want to acknowledge all of the speakers. I want to acknowledge again our colleagues, Jean Henry and Terry McGinnis, who are here with us and fully support us. I want to really kind of acknowledge, we've got some powerhouse people that joined us, and I just feel your presence: Stephen Krashen, David and Bonnie Freeman, Peter Fries, Sharon Murphy, Jack D'Amico, David Yaden, and I could actually go on, but I just wanted you to know that we are in the presence of brilliance here. And what we're going to do now, Alan, any final words before? Alan, would you put up the, well, first final words, and then would you put up the...
My final words, Debbie, I would echo everything you said. I also want to thank all of our presenters. This is an immense, been a wonderful conference, a wonderful success, and what a mighty group of presenters. So thank you one and all. One thing I would add, Debbie, had this been a conventional conference, we'd all be heading out to dinner now.
Yes.
That's going to have to wait for the next time.
And we would have had bagels, and we would have had lunch, and we would have had dinner last night, and there would have been a lot of food. So I hope you have a nice dinner planned and had some snacks along the way.